Has anyone ever experienced sleep paralysis? I have to say, it's one of the strangest, most fascinating, and yet utterly terrifying things you can go through. Imagine being completely aware of your surroundings, but unable to move. A state somewhere between waking and sleeping. I'd heard stories about it before, but I never really understood what it was like until it happened to me. It only happened once back in college. I was going through one of the toughest times of my life, finals week. Stress was at an all-time high, and I was barely sleeping. It must have been the night before my last final. I had stayed up late cramming for my biology exam. At some point, I decided to call it a night, but everything became a blur after that, just darkness. The next thing I remember, I was in my bed in my room, but something felt off. My awareness was clouded, like I was awake but still half asleep. I tried to move, but I couldn't. The only thing I could control was my eyes, darting around the dimly lit room. As I looked to one side of the room, something shifted. When I turned my gaze back to the center, I saw her, a woman. She was standing in the middle of the room, facing my bed. She wore a black dress and held something long in her hands. I wanted to scream, to call out for my mom, but the paralysis gripped me too tightly. I couldn't make a sound. The woman moved closer until she knelt beside me, reaching out to touch my forehead. I could feel it, her touch real and cold. She leaned in, locking eyes with me, and to my shock, I saw my mother's face staring back at me. I tried to speak, to cry out, "Mom," with everything I had, but I was still trapped in my own body, unable to move or make a sound. She stood up slowly, turned, and walked toward the doorway. Without a word, she disappeared into the shadows of the house. For what felt like another 10 or 20 seconds, I lay there, frozen and helpless. Then, suddenly, my vision sharpened. My thoughts became clear. The fog lifted, and I could move again. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and leapt out of bed, screaming, "Mom, Mom," over and over. I ran into the hallway, shouting her name in desperation. A door down the hall creaked open, and someone came out to hug me. But it wasn't my mom, it was my dad. He held me tightly, his voice shaky as he said, "I miss her too." The weight of reality came crashing down on me. My mom had passed away just 3 weeks before this happened. You know what's strange about dreams? How vague, surreal, and utterly bizarre they can be. They pull you into a world where nothing has to make sense. And yet, sometimes, they feel so real it's impossible to shake them. What happens when that otherworldly unease crosses over into the so-called real world? You'll understand what I mean in a moment. I was in REM sleep, caught in a bizarre nightmare. In it, I was being followed by some strange, shadowy creature in the middle of the woods. But the dream began to blur and fade until I found myself waking up, sort of. I was back in my bed, my room familiar, yet somehow foreign. I say kind of because while my mind had surfaced from the dream, my body hadn't. I was completely paralyzed. That's when I started to hear it. A faint, strange noise. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part mechanical, part organic, almost alive. It started soft, barely audible, but it repeated every 3 seconds, growing louder and more menacing with each cycle. It wasn't just the volume. The sound felt closer, like it was inching toward me. It grew so unbearably loud inside my head that I wanted to scream, to do anything to make it stop, but I couldn't. Then my eyes fixated on the closet door. Specifically, the small crack in the door, dark and unyielding. I couldn't look away, which I never, ever leave open, but there it was. The distorted face of a man peering through the crack. His grotesque, unnaturally wide smile was frozen in place, stretching far beyond what seemed humanly possible. Every time that awful noise echoed, it felt like both the closet and the face were inching closer and closer to me. The pressure was suffocating, the fear unbearable. Then, suddenly, the closet door slammed shut with a deafening bang and the noise stopped. Silence engulfed the room. Moments later, I regained control of my body. The first thing I did, despite being 24 years old, was run straight to my parents' room to wake up my dad. I begged him to check the closet with me. Together, we opened the closet door. Nothing. There was nothing inside. My dad even searched the rest of my room, but there was no sign of anything unusual. He reassured me, explaining that what I'd experienced was likely sleep paralysis. He admitted he'd gone through it once himself, but knowing that didn't make me feel any less unsettled by what I'd just endured. Years later, I still think about that night, that face, that sound, that overwhelming sense that something truly evil was lurking in my closet. But somehow, I knew I was dreaming, and I told myself I needed to face my fear. I tried to avoid looking directly at the closet door, but every time I moved my eyes, my entire head would shift away instead. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't focus on it. Then I woke up, or so I thought. I was drenched in a cold sweat, relieved at first that it was over, but within moments, the relief vanished. It wasn't a dream. There was something in the closet. I lay there on my back, completely paralyzed, unable to move or even cry out. I didn't hear anything, exactly, but I could feel it. The sickening sensation of laughter. It wasn't sound. It was like waves of malevolent energy emanating from the closet, washing over me. Then, out of nowhere, the thing hurled a human head at me. It landed on my chest. Face up, I recognized her immediately. A girl I knew from high school. Up until that moment, I had managed to stay terrified but composed. That composure shattered. Panic overwhelmed me. And though I wanted to scream, the only sounds I could produce were guttural grunts and moans. I strained desperately, trying to rock my body from side to side to shake it off, but I couldn't move. This horrifying struggle seemed to last an eternity, maybe a minute or two, before I finally woke up for real. The trauma of that experience lingered. For weeks afterward, every time I woke up, I was terrified that I wasn't actually awake, that something unspeakable could happen at any moment. The memory still makes my skin crawl, especially when I think about that laugh. What makes it even stranger is that at the time, I had never heard of sleep paralysis or night terrors. I genuinely thought I was losing my mind. I've had sleep paralysis 3 times in my life. The first 2 were terrifying but straightforward. I woke up unable to move. The third time, though, was unlike anything else. It was early morning, probably between 5 and 6, just as the sun was starting to rise. The room was dimly lit, and as I tried to move, that all too familiar paralysis set in. I was helpless, my eyes fixed on the wall. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps coming up the stairs to my bedroom. They were slow, deliberate. As the steps reached my door, my family entered, my brother, sister, dad, and mom. But something was wrong. They were all sobbing uncontrollably, and each of them seemed unnaturally tall, towering at least a foot above their normal height. It was deeply unsettling. The 4 of them approached my bed, stopping right beside it. They loomed over me, their towering forms nearly reaching the ceiling, all of them sobbing uncontrollably. I was paralyzed, unable to move or call for help. I wanted to scream at them to stop because their presence was terrifying me. The way their exaggerated heights seemed to distort reality made everything feel nightmarish. Then, as suddenly as they had entered, they turned around in unison and walked back down the stairs, leaving me frozen in place. The moment I regained control of my body, I bolted out of bed and ran after them. But when I reached the downstairs area, there was no one there. Desperate and confused, I checked each of their rooms one by one. To my shock, all 4 of them were fast asleep, undisturbed. My heart was pounding in my chest. What I had just experienced was so surreal, so unnerving, that it left me questioning everything I had just seen. I had to lean against the wall, trying to gather my thoughts as I struggled to steady my breathing. My heart was racing, and the weight of what had just happened was overwhelming. Falling back asleep wasn't an option. I was too shaken. Instead, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise and bring some sense of normalcy. A few days later, something unexpected happened. While crossing the road with friends, I was struck by a speeding car. The impact left me with 3 broken bones and a fractured thigh bone. I was rushed to the hospital, where I ended up staying for a week. At one point during my stay, all 4 members of my family came to visit me. They stood by my bedside, looking down at me. My mom, overcome with emotion, was crying softly. It was eerily familiar, almost identical to the image from my sleep paralysis. The memory of that night hit me like a wave, sending a chill down my spine. I'm not superstitious, not even a little, but if I were, I'd be convinced that dream was some kind of sign or a glimpse into the future. Honestly, I just got chills writing that last sentence. It's unsettling to think about. There was this one night back in the summer of 2016 when I was out late drinking with friends. We'd been wandering around town, just aimlessly walking and talking, eventually making our way through the neighborhood. At some point, one of my friends suddenly stopped and pointed at a bush in someone's front yard. "Look," he said, his voice low but urgent. Curious, we all moved a little closer to see what he was talking about. Sure enough, there was something or someone hiding in the bush. It was hard to make out, but there was definitely a figure crouched in the shadows. As we got closer, this strange, unsettling sound came from the bush. It was so bizarre and off-putting that we froze for a second, then collectively lost it. We screamed, laughed nervously, and bolted down the street like a bunch of kids. We screamed because it was genuinely terrifying, but we ran off laughing because the whole situation was so bizarrely funny. There were enough of us that it didn't feel like we were in any real danger. We just assumed whoever was in that bush was some random person messing with people. Eventually, we all went our separate ways and headed home. I fell asleep pretty easily that night, mostly thanks to the drinks I'd had. But the next thing I remember was waking up to near total darkness in my room. I couldn't see the clock or even turn my head to check the time. I was completely immobilized. It didn't take long to realize I was in a state of sleep paralysis. Unable to move, I scanned the room with just my eyes. That's when I heard it. A sound I instantly recognized. It was the same eerie, unsettling noise we'd heard coming from the bush earlier that night. Then I looked straight ahead, toward the foot of my bed, and saw something that still haunts me. A grotesque, floating head. Something out of a nightmare. Its face was twisted and demonic, its ghostly features horrifyingly vivid. As it drew closer, I realized it wasn't just a head. There was a body, but it blended into the pitch-black shadows of the room, making it almost invisible. Its mouth hung open, emitting that same noise from the bush over and over. It got so close that it was mere inches from my face. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it faded away into nothing. That's when I could finally move again. I let out a scream, sat up in bed, and flicked on the lamp. My heart was pounding, and I was gasping for air. I frantically checked around my bed, but whatever that thing was, it was gone. What I had just experienced felt terrifyingly real. It didn't feel like a dream at all. The next day, I told my parents about it. They agreed it sounded like sleep paralysis, but admitted they'd never heard of anyone seeing something so horrifying before.